Good morning. Today I wanted to talk with you guys about the Second Amendment. This amendment seems relatively straightforward, but it is hugely controversial. I would argue that it could stem in part based on the interesting grammar used by the founding fathers. Let's first take a look at the basic text. A well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. The reason why I include all those commas is that according to a number of constitutional scholars as well as the Supreme Court, those commas really matter here. And it has led to vastly different interpretations of the Second Amendment. You can see what different conclusions conservatives draw about this, where they ultimately argue that Chicago, with some of the strictest gun laws in the country, has a far higher number of homicides than does Austin, which has far less gun restrictions in place, which you can see here. Liberals take a very different view, though, and you can imagine that what they point to are the rise in the amount of mass shootings. And the poster here reads, "How did a well-regulated militia get twisted to mean a well-armed, unregulated populace?" This difference between militia here and right of the people is really at the heart of what the debate on the Second Amendment comes down to. Let's take a look at the first case where this really came to pass, that debate over that question. So that case here that we're going to look at is U.S. v. Miller. This is a man who sued the United States for arguing that his confiscation and his criminal charges based on his ownership of a sawed-off shotgun was perfectly protected under the Second Amendment, and that any charges against him would violate his Second Amendment rights. But what I want you to pay especially close attention to down here, guys, is that the Supreme Court decided on an 8-1 ruling, okay, that was not protected because a sawed-off shotgun would not be used in a well-regulated militia. Now, the reason why that becomes so important, guys, is that the clear focus here is the purpose that the sawed-off shotgun serves in the militia itself, not an individual's right, but the militia's use of the sawed-off shotgun. So kind of a collective right as opposed to an individual right. That's really where the importance of this debate becomes so important and set a precedent that lasted nearly 70 years. And that is until a specific case with the District of Columbia versus Heller. This involved the District of Columbia's gun regulations and gun restrictions here. Here I want you to look at Justice Scalia's statements here, though, that became so important. And he wrote the majority opinion in this case. It reads, "Nowhere else in the Constitution does a right attributed to the people refer to anything other than an individual right. Recognize, he is focusing on the individual right, whereas the U.S. v. Miller focused on the collective right of the militia." Guys, this very much changed the federal government's views of guns and the ability to regulate those guns, because now it becomes an individual's rights for self-defense. The next case 2 years later with McDonald v. Chicago goes even further. McDonald was a security guard that sued the state of Chicago, arguing that he had a right for his weapons to be fully loaded within his home. Yet the state of Chicago argued that he needed to have it fully unloaded and within a gun safe. So there were some pretty strict laws within Chicago there. What's important about this specific case is how it uses selective incorporation in its decision. I want you to look at the decision here. Yes, the court ruled that the 14th Amendment, through the Due Process Clause, this is really important, we're coming back to that again, makes the right to keep and bear arms for the purpose of self-defense applicable to the states. So let's go further here. Writing for the four justices, Justices Samuel Alito held that the Second Amendment was incorporated via the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, and the right to keep and bear arms applies to state and local governments as well as the federal government. What I think is so interesting about this specific ruling, guys, is that through selective incorporation now, federal gun rights become at the state and local level. This is going to make it a lot harder for state and local governments to set more restrictive gun restrictions. And these two cases have been hugely controversial because of that specific potential there. Now, whether or not you can blame looser gun laws on the mass shootings, I think that's a little unfair, but you do need to look at what this comes down to. Is it an individual right or is it a collective right? And should this have been made on a state and local level as well through selective incorporation? Should that have ever happened? Again, points of contention here. The dissents here in both the DC versus Heller case as well as McDonald v. Chicago, again, focus on the militia. Let's look here. The Second Amendment was adopted to protect the right of the people of each of the several states to maintain a well-regulated militia. Okay? He points out it was a response to concerns raised during the ratification of the Constitution that the power of Congress to disarm the state militias and create a national standing army. In other words, guys, it's important to remember the historical context here. And that is that it was the colonial militias and the states that were rising up against the British here. And they wanted to make sure that if you were going to have a stronger federal government, that the states maintained those militias, that they maintained that power there. Breyer, in the later decision, McDonald v. Chicago, uses similar arguments. Okay? He ultimately says that substantive due process right does not include a general right to keep and bear arms for the purposes of private self-defense. Okay? So recognize the radically different conclusions that the two sides ultimately came up here. But again, as I say down here, both here say it's a collective right. To what extent do you agree? This is something that you need to be thinking about, as it could ultimately determine how we set gun laws within this country. And that, folks, is a lot of the controversy surrounding this amendment. Thanks for the time, everybody. Enjoy. Bye.